Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The government's universal credit system may never deliver value for money. That's according to a damning report by the National Audit Office that says the single payment scheme may cost more than the benefits system it replaces. A short while ago, Sky News spoke to Ian Duncan-Smith, the former cabinet minister responsible for universal credit.
If there's a measure of universal credit impact, this Airdrie Food Bank might be it. It's operated through the change in the benefit system. Numbers needing help here have doubled.
The amount that they receive in universal credit is very low, and they have to heat their house, they've got other bills to pay, gas, electricity, and unfortunately when it comes to buying food, they're left with very little.
The food bank finding here is echoed in a damning report by the National Audit Office. And there's more. The spending watchdog says universal credit hasn't delivered value for money, and that it might never. The report found the rollout of universal credit had been due by October last year, but as of today it's only being claimed by 10% of those entitled. Between January and October last year, of late payments, 40% were delayed by 11 weeks, 20% were almost 5 months late. In the same period, 1 claimant in 5 didn't receive full payment in time. 1 in 10 received no payment at all.
And we spoke to lots of national and local organisations that are working with the claimants, and they showed us enough evidence to really demonstrate that a significant minority, are struggling. These claimants are struggling to make their claim online. They're struggling to cope until they get their first payment, and they're struggling with the fluctuating income that universal credit provides.
Pauline Boyd claims universal credit. The report found that for people in her position, the Department of Work and Pensions hadn't assessed the hardship they suffer.
They don't pay you enough money to live on. There is no way. You know, I'm running a home on £317 a month. It is a complete struggle.
Despite its criticisms, the National Audit Office concludes that universal credit is here to stay. Returning to the previous benefits regime, it says, would be so complex and costly that there's no practical alternative but to continue on.
We don't agree with some of the conclusions that the NO has come up with. We also have to look at the context of the legacy benefit system. It's incredibly complicated. We've rolled 6 benefits into one. We've made sure that instead of 3 agencies delivering benefits, it's one. And I can tell you from talking to claimants as I go around the country visiting job centres, they think that the system is much simpler and easier, and actually the disincentives of not taking on work have gone, which means that what we're now seeing with universal credit, and we've put out analysis on this, is that people are able to increase their levels of employment and their employment prospects.
Others beg to differ. In its withering critique, the National Audit Office says universal credit could end up costing more than the system it replaces, and the government will never be able to measure its stated goal of increasing employment. James Matthews, Sky News, Airdrie.
Well, let's talk now to Ed Boyd. He's the former advisor to Ian Duncan-Smith and now manages the Centre for Social Justice as a think tank. We're also joined this hour by Alfie Sterling, Head of Economics at the New Economics Foundation. Gentlemen, it's good to have you on the programme this morning. Ed, let's start with you first. I know that this is the brainchild of Ian Duncan-Smith, a man that you've worked with for many years. It's not working, though, is it?
Well, you say that, and there's a number of things NAA report that are really useful that give ideas about how to improve universal credit. The one thing it doesn't kind of highlight, and this package hasn't highlighted yet, is that all the evidence so far of those who've been onto universal credit show that it is working. It shows that people compared with the old system are far more likely to be in work, that they're more likely to be earning more money, and they're more likely to sustain that job as well. So overall, there is a benefit from this. Not to say it's perfect. No welfare system ever is. It's working in a complex and often difficult space to try and support people who may have not worked for many years back into work. But overall, there is a lot of evidence that show that it is working. So I think I see see it from a slightly different perspective, given that weight of evidence that we've seen already.
OK, let's bring in a different perspective and get the views of Alfie Sterling. So these are just teething problems, Alfie, and according to Ed Boyd, it is working. What do you think?
Well, just quickly on that point from Ed, I think it's really important to remember that the evidence that he's referring to was cited in the National Audit Office report, and actually it's both quite old, but it also isn't representative of all UC claimants. In fact, it only actually looked at a small group of claimants who had the most simple benefit needs to treat and found a small benefit there, but it's not representative across the piece. That's actually one of the most damning conclusions of this report was that we don't actually know how effective it's going to be because we're not collecting all the necessary data. That means both in terms of how much it's going to cost, but also in terms of its impact and bringing people into work. We're not even collecting the right data. But a point I wanted to make more broadly on this is that when you're thinking about the effectiveness of a policy, you need to not just think about the implementation, which is what this Audit Office report was about, but also the actual policy design. And one of the problems we have here is that the amount of money that has been taken out of universal credit since its initial conception, in fact, since people like Ed were initially designing this in the early part of this decade, has meant it literally cannot deliver on its own terms.
Yeah, we'll talk about the people, which of course are the most important in a few minutes. But Ed, let's just pick up on the money, because the money is eye-watering, isn't it? £2 billion it's cost so far, 6 years behind schedule, and the National Audit Office says they may never get their money back. I mean, it's extraordinary. If this was happening in the private sector, you know, people would be fired.
Well, let's make a comparison to give a sense of proportion here. It's going to cost around £2 billion, which you're right is a substantial amount of money to invest in changing welfare and hopefully changing people's lives for the better. When it's fully rolled out, it's due to save around £8 billion a year. Let's compare that, say, with Heathrow, another thing, and the extra runway there, which people know a fair amount about. That's going to be a £14 billion worth investment for £7 billion every single year. And it's interesting to see the level of scrutiny that you'll get on the savings of this project, which has lots of political people wanting to make their voice heard in it, and on Heathrow, the not having the same level of
but we're not here to talk about
Heathrow.
I just want you to talk about the universal benefits in particular. We're not here to talk about Heathrow. And again, I'll go back to the comment from the National Audit Office that says it's unlikely to ever deliver value for money.
So the business case is really clear, based on clear academic principles.
So you disagree with them? You disagree with the National Audit Office and what they've said?
I think I agree with the business case that universal credit has been set out with from a financial side, which is it's a £2 billion investment for £8 billion saved a year. Let's say instead of £8 billion, they only make a quarter of that. They only make £2 billion a year. That is still a good investment, but it also slightly misses the point. Even if this cost a significant amount of money rather than saving money, if it changed people's lives for the better by helping more people out of poverty, by getting them into a job and helping them to earn more money, it would be worth it. Welfare reform is not primarily about saving money, but it's about changing people's lives. And that is where the focus needs to be, because that is what will really make a difference.
Well, let's ask Alfie Sterling that very point. I mean, the big issue here is getting people back into work. The previous system really stopped people from being able to do that in terms of having the ability, and it was far too complex. This system encourages people to get back into work. Surely that's a good thing.
Well, I completely agree that the really important thing here is not whether it's saving money, but the impact on people and people's lives. I have a completely different view, and actually the evidence has a completely different picture to how Ed just painted the effects of universal credit. So one of the initial aims was to be able to support people into work. It was supposed to initially only take away 55p in benefits every pound that someone worked. Now, when you add taxation on top of benefit withdrawal, people on minimum wage with 2 children and a partner not in work will be losing 75p in every pound of extra earning. And that means these people are struggling to make ends meet. They're also disincentivised to move into work. And the welfare system, as it stands, is failing them.
OK, Ed, what do you say to that?
Yeah, well, so this is the point we completely agree on, in that more money should be invested in universal credit. We think it has the right...
Fair enough, but Alfie was making the point there that it's actually disincentivising people to get back to work. It's not making it easier.
I don't think he's making that point. I think he was saying it's not incentivising people enough, because people aren't allowed to keep as much of their money as when we originally designed it, they would have been able to. We have been campaigning strongly over the last year to persuade government to put the money back in that were taken out with Osborne's £12 billion cut. So we completely agree with things on this side. The one point I'd make alongside that, though, is everyone imagines that the welfare system should be a perfect system. It is impossible with this to work in this area and create a perfect system. What we need to do is say, is it better than the last one? I think there's strong evidence to show that it is, and then think about how we can continually improve it to make it better. Putting more money back into the system, making sure that it works more closely with voluntary sector organisations on the ground to really support people to transition into work will totally help them, the government, to do this more effectively. And I think Alfie and I both agree that this is the direction the government needs to be taking over the coming year.
OK, we'll leave it there. Ed Boyd, who works for the Centre for Social Justice, and Alfie Sterling, Head of Economics at the New Economics Foundation. Thanks for your time this morning. Government's universal credit system may never deliver value for money. That's according to a damning report by the National Audit Office that says the single payment scheme may cost more than the benefit system that it replaces. Well, a short while ago, Sky News spoke to Ian Duncan-Smith, the former Cabinet Minister responsible for universal credit.
He has said they don't agree with the report at all. They hardly nearly signed it off, that the NAO did not include any of the Treasury's figures for savings in their report, and the report is a year out of date because all the changes that were made just before December last year that have changed and added extra money back, which I resigned over because I said there needed to be the money that they had taken out put back in. And the DWP's done that, and none of those are in this report. So all I can say is I haven't read the report, but I know that the DWP is deeply uneasy about it and doesn't agree with it. And my answer is you need to speak to them about it, really.
As the architect of universal credit, how disappointed do you feel when you see these sort of
Well, my view is, as the Jovis Roundtree said, this is the greatest potential to change child poverty that exists in government. It's a third rolled out. It still needs to complete the rollout. The rollout was deliberately set slowly and carefully so that if there are issues, they can make the changes. That's exactly what's been going on. So any criticism of the slow rollout, it was quite deliberately done so that you don't have any chaos, etc. as you do it. The changes are being made. They're made last December, as I understand it, and those changes have added an extra billion and a half, I think, back into it. I wanted all of the money put back in. There is yet more scope for that. But I do believe genuinely this programme will be an enormous force for change and good. People go back to work quicker, they stay and work longer, and they earn more. And those were the figures agreed by the IFS. So all I say is go and speak to DWP about it because I haven't seen the report personally.
And finally, I know you've stopped to speak to us. Undoubtedly, there are people waiting a long time still for their payments. What do you say to them?
Well, the DWP has been dealing with this. These advances, now over 80% get their money exactly on time, and of the remainder, they get at least a proportion of their money, as I understand it. Got to bear in mind with this, which I don't think the report covers, is that 60% of the people coming onto this from the old benefit system carry debts from that system, undischarged from tax credits. So it's wrong to say these are debts. There's no evidence at all of that as debts coming directly. But, you know, the DWP is working to make sure all those issues are right. But in any rollout, you will go through this. My answer is go and speak to the DWP about it. I don't have the up-to-date information. All I can say is this benefit, I genuinely believe, will help people live better, higher quality lives and get people into work much quicker. And I think all of the independent reports show that's the case.
Torsten Bell is the director of Resolution Foundation, which aims to improve the standard of living of low and middle income families. Torsten, thanks for joining us. Universal credit, a pretty damning report from the NAO this morning. Fair to say it's not fit for purpose?
Well, I mean, the main thing to take away from this is that universal credit is just a big deal. This is a big deal affecting, at the moment, only about 800,000 families, but rolling out to 8 million families. Most of working families with kids, at some stage, will be on universal credit in the 2020s. So this is a big deal, and we've got to get it right as a country. And yes, the NAO report today is probably, in some ways, bad news for people in the department, because it does say both that there's problems with the rollout, how the actual policy change has been delivered in practice, and that's led to hardship for some people, but there are also challenges with the actual policy underpinning that, and those things on both fronts need to be put right. We need the right rollout, but we also need to make sure we get the policy that is being rolled out correct.
Just on, before we get on to kind of the hardship element, on the finances of it, there was an expectation that it would deliver an annual benefit of £8 billion a year. That was the government's sell of folding all these benefits into universal credit. The National Audit Office says that remains unproven. Is this a waste of taxpayers' money?
Well, one of the other things the NAO says is we'll probably never know the answer to that question, so which is a hard thing to admit, but we probably won't know, and that's because obviously once we've moved to universal credit, we won't know what the old system will have cost. But look, are there some warning signs? Yes, it's costing us a lot more to process universal credit cases at the moment, over £600, than we're looking for it to cost, under £200 by the time it's fully rolled out. Now, that's partly because these are harder cases, unemployed people at the moment, and later there'll be more people that can do it online. But it's also because there's reductions in the benefits in terms of how many people the government expects to be, more people to be in work because of the move to universal credit. They used to say it'd be 300,000, they're now saying it'll be nearer 200,000, and only half of that delivered by the improved financial incentives the system's meant to bring. I
mean, the whole policy was designed, obviously, to get more people back into work and to make welfare work. That was the great strapline of the idea of it all. The NAO also had evidence in the report that many people are suffering difficulties and hardships during the rollout. And, of course, we've seen dozens and dozens of such stories. Are you concerned about that? And do you think it's really exacerbating difficulties for people in poverty?
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of fronts to that. So on the question of are people suffering hardship, clearly you can see cases of that. You can see it in the data, but you can also see it in the real world if you spend time in job centres or at food banks, other things. People are clearly raising that. It's clearly, and the specific pitch points have been around when people get their first payment. Mm-hmm. The government has made some changes, but you can see in the data, in the NAO report, 1 in 5 people still not getting paid in full or on time for their first payment. That's clearly a big deal, and that would, if you're, when you need that first payment, that's clearly really important, and there are things that could be done to speed that up, particularly around how we deal with housing in the system. And housing is actually one of the other issues where, because of a move from housing benefit being moved into this system, we have seen an uptick in arrears in some sectors. Now, again, the government is trying to deal with that. They're working with social housing providers and some private landlords to try and make that system easier and less people having to go into arrears, but there is some pressure in that system. And that's where you're seeing these, what are both a mixture of rollout challenges, can they get the information they need from universal credit claimants quick enough, but also policy challenges, the way in which the actual system works.
I mean, last year there was a Tory rebellion over this, and they did get changes in the budget, and they did get tweaks to it, as you talked about, slightly reducing the wait time, etc., etc. If you could kind of pull out 1 or 2 big changes that you think would alleviate the hardship people suffer, what would it be?
Well, the big thing we need to do is, because as your report said, the NAO says that whatever you think about universal credit, it's almost impossible to go back now. That's their view. Yeah. That is actually why DWP won't be as upset about this report as the front page of the papers this morning would lead you to believe. Because in the end, if it's unstoppable, they'll think, well, anyone's going ahead with this, and then it's just about getting it right. So in terms of getting it right, we should be thinking really carefully. This policy was designed for an era where people said the problem was worklessness, families with nobody in them working. That is not the problem in 21st century Britain. We have record employment levels, and instead what we need is people able to earn more, progress, and to do more hours. And to achieve that, we should reformat universal credit so it gives stronger incentives for second earners, largely women, but not all, and for single parents to be in work and to be rewarded for doing so. And the danger with the system is it was designed for an era that we're no longer in.
OK, well, thank you. Thank you, Torsten, for coming in to talk to us.
Well, let's talk about policy. Government policy and the government's universal credit programme, because it was a sort of centrepiece, is a centrepiece of their policy offering, and it's come in for a kicking.
Yeah, this idea of merging 6 different benefits into one, the idea that you make the whole system simpler and you make it more transparent that working is better than not in terms of claiming benefits. Now, the whole thing has taken forever to roll out. In fact, it's probably an understatement to describe it as forever. Along has come this National Audit Office report that, frankly, has given it a right old kicking.
Let's have a look at the front page, actually, of The Guardian, because I think we can see the headline there. Oh, right, sorry, it's gone. It's been and gone.
This morning's newspaper.
It is.
Already gone. So yeah, this National Audit Office report, hugely critical, saying that there's huge delays in how long people are waiting in order to get money. And, by definition, this is people who don't have a great deal of money and hugely reliant on this money that is coming in their direction. The government is saying in response that it's not as bad as it was, basically, seems to be the essence. That's not a direct quote, but Alok Sharma, the Employment Minister, was saying that the rate at which they're able to get people onto the benefit is not as bad as the period in which the NAO looked at how it was doing.
Isn't that something of a disaster in terms of political credibility? I mean, we spent all this time, it's been hugely controversial, endless criticism about it, and now it might not even be good value for money.
Governments and IT projects never seem to do very well, do they? It was supposed to all been rolled out completely nationally to all benefit claimants by 2014, now 2021, if we're lucky. Who are we kidding? No, I've yet to meet anybody, actually, who's in the mainstream of politics who actually thinks the principles behind it were wrong. It's a question of, putting them all together, making work pay, tapering it off. And I think people have to remember that there are long delays getting universal credit, and those are totally unacceptable. Most people on average and higher incomes would struggle without a pay packet coming in for a month or even a couple of weeks. Their bills would go unpaid. But the issue is that people have always had to wait to get benefits.
Yeah, and Labour did say in principle they are behind the idea of universal credit. So is it just in the execution?
Well, I mean, if it is, then it's not like they weren't warned, because right at the beginning with IDS and his whole team, people said, you're basically proposing to build a bridge to America. Somebody comes in and says, let's build a bridge to America, you laugh at them. If they say, let's put everybody on universal credit at once, you can say, when can you start? And of course, they couldn't do it at once. And when they tried to do even the pilots, I reported when I was a reporter here at the BBC, on the pilots, they were a catastrophe. And people said, look, the advantage of it is not getting people on it, it's as they leave, it tapers. All three benefits work together and taper off. It's a brilliant idea in principle, but the problem we're talking about here with the NAO is the front end. When you're on it, it's not 4 weeks like you're waiting for a pay packet, it's 11 weeks. And if you are on struggling and scrabbling around at the end of Tesco's aisle with all the yellow...
It's not 11 weeks now.
What the NAO says...
No, it's been shorter. It has been shortened, but not as much as people wanted.
If you're
that is not the norm. That's
scrabbling around with no money, getting sort of out-of-date food, it is a terrible indictment on the government's capacity to care for you.
I think it's an inability of the political class to understand how ordinary people live day to day, actually.
Right, well, let's have a look at another front page. This is the Telegraph, and this is on the NHS and spending. And obviously, this has been a huge issue as far as the government is concerned. Which of you here now doesn't believe there's going to be some sort of spending announcement on the NHS?
No, I mean, surely we all know that money. They're making sure that comes out again and again, aren't they? The question is it going to be enough money? Because we need that money, the extra $4 billion, we need that money just to stand still.
It's not just the $4 billion. I mean, look, Darcy in this IPPR report today is saying that they should, basically, if you're on social care, you should be getting that free of a means test. We're moving, I think, the political class has to move towards health and social care being state provided, largely out of taxation. And that's, of course, good. It's not just a challenge for Philip Hammond, it's a challenge for it will enlarge the tax take of this country, and we're going to have to just bite the bullet and do it.
And where should that money come from, Julia?
I think you're probably surprised. I do actually agree with you on that. Well, for a start, we could save an awful lot of money in the social care budget by actually getting people out of the NHS. I mean, the bed block, and we talked about that so many times over the years. But
in terms of raising funds, where would you get it from?
I think it should be from general taxation. I do think also the baby boomers, like my parents, the generation that had everything for free, bought homes that went up in value, didn't have to pay for education, all of this, and get the final salary pension schemes. I do think that generation have had it a bit too good and perhaps need to pay some back.
I mean, there have been record low levels, people would argue, in terms of funding into the NHS if you look at it historically. Why is Labour only promising 2% as a percentage?
Well, I think that was the promise at the last election in the manifesto.
Is that enough?
I don't think it is enough, no. And I think that one of the problems Labour's going to have as it goes forward towards the next election is that 49 billion fiscal transfer that it proposed, 11 billion corporation tax, etc., isn't enough. And what you have to do is to borrow. And I think that, again, this is why I say, whether it's Labour, the Lib Dems, whoever's leading the Tory party at the time, borrowing to finance public spending is sometimes necessary, and because it's an investment. Of course, you don't want to borrow to finance day-to-day expenditure.
Well, as long as you can ever pay it back, though.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
the key thing. But at what point are we going to stop ageing and needing more medical treatment?
The government's flagship welfare programme may never deliver value for money, according to a damning report by the public spending watchdog. The National Audit Office said that universal credit might end up costing more than the benefit system it was designed to replace, while leaving many of the most vulnerable claimants in hardship, waiting months for payments. Our North of England correspondent Claire Fallon reports.
160 miles from London, in the shadow of the Pennines, 5 years ago, universal credit came to Ashton-under-Lyne. A pilot, to use the language of government, an exercise in human misery, to use the language of Charlotte Hughes.
We're being used as a cruel experiment by the government as to how little we can make someone live and how we can make them suffer. That is how a lot of people see it. It does feel like a cruel, cruel experiment.
An experiment her daughter was part of. She was pregnant when she was sanctioned, a clinical word for the reality of having your money stopped. Since then, every Thursday, Charlotte has protested outside Ashton Job Centre. That was 4 years ago, more than 200 Thursdays ago.
It's democide. I call it democide because that's what it is. Because you're systematically taking the poorest people in society. You're taking everything they've known and loved off them and expecting them to live with nothing.
Universal Credit is a new service that helps ensure you're better off in work than you are on benefits.
6 benefits rolled into one. Universal Credit was the brainchild of Ian Duncan Smith.
I am delighted to announce the introduction of the Universal Credit, which will, I believe, restore fairness and simplicity to a complex, outdated and wildly expensive benefits system.
Since then, pilot has become policy, rolled out to more places, more people. But according to the National Audit Office, it is too slow, too expensive, not just in terms of the hard, cold economics, but also in terms of the human cost. 8 years after Universal Credit was first announced, it's only being claimed by about 10% of those expected to end up on the benefit. 20% of people who've been paid late were waiting 5 months or more to get their money, and it's seemingly not saving the money it was supposed, currently costing about £700 per claim. That's 4 times as much as the government intended. But the Audit Office report concludes we're so far in, the government has no alternative but to continue.
What I can tell you from talking directly to claimants when I go around job centres and of course talking to work coaches as well, is that they feel this is a much easier system for them, and we're seeing the results. If you're on Universal Credit, the chance of getting into work are better.
So it's all good, it's all working. But Charlotte told me the Employment Minister must be visiting different job centres to the one she protests outside. It really upsets you, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Because I've seen people starving, literally starving. We're dealing with hunger like I've never seen before.
The government says it's learned from the pilots, reduced the wait for payments. But many believe Universal Credit must go before it does more damage.
Claire Fallon reporting there.
The government has been severely criticised in an official report on its flagship benefit reform, Universal Credit. The National Audit Office has accused ministers of being in denial over the financial hardship it causes to some claimants. It says £2 billion have been spent introducing the benefits so far. It could prove more expensive than the system it's replacing. Of the 1 million people who currently receive the new combined benefit, 20% experience delays in receiving their first payment, some lasting months. And it costs nearly £700 to administer each claim. That's 4 times higher than originally intended. But the government insists it is a good value for money. Michael Buchanan reports.
My name's Alex Tiffin and I've been on Universal Credit since November.
Alex is 30 and has a range of physical and psychiatric problems. For 2 weeks last month, he tweeted daily what it was like to survive on Universal Credit. In his case, £95 a fortnight.
Day 1, update of a Universal Credit sufferer. Got my fortnightly £95, TV licence £12, baby milk £9.50, money left for 2 weeks £10.50.
By day 5, after buying bread and cheese, he's left with £3.30. By day 11, all his money is gone. Could I get an advance if possible of £30? I have no food. We sat down to look through his Universal Credit journal.
And no advance is available to you for those reasons. So not having
Alex took out an advance to help him through the initial wait for his first Universal Credit payment. He accepts he has to repay it, but he's being docked £125 each month, 40% of his total allowance. What has it meant not to have any money?
No food, no heating, sitting in bed for a week at a time, wrapped up in my duvet, with a jumper on sometimes because, you know, it's not too warm in the Highlands, even in summer, and just drinking water
The National Audit Office said today the use of food banks increased and rent arrears rose when universal credit came to an area. But ministers repeatedly refused to accept the new benefit creates financial problems for some people.
What we have seen is that the vast majority of people are able to cope on universal credit, and in fact, for very many of them, their life chances improve as a result of getting to work and earning more money.
For some claimants,
and
does universal credit cause
people,
hardship or not? It's I've asked you five times, with all due respect, sir. Yeah, and you haven't given me a straight answer. For some claimants, does universal credit cause hardship?
What I'm telling you is that we have made changes which have now meant that people can get 100% advances up front on day one if they require, and that is making a positive difference to people.
Despite the problems that Alex and others have had with universal credit, the troubled benefit will continue, given the time and money already spent in it. Today's report says scrapping it is not a viable option.
So, Michael, let me get this clear. The National Audit Office says universal credit is too expensive, poor value for money and causing financial difficulties for 2 in 5 people. The government says it is good value for money and not causing financial hardship. So who are we supposed to believe?
Talking to the Department for Work and Pensions over the past couple of days about universal credit, it is in some ways like talking to some sort of flat earth movement. They simply refuse to accept but the benefit is causing hardship for a significant minority of people on the benefit. That is despite not just the evidence in today's report, but their own research. Last week, they published some research that commissioned of claimants on universal credit, and amongst the findings in that survey was a suggestion that 40% of claimants are struggling financially, not just in the initial stages of universal credit, but many months later. Now, the government's argument is this: we've made some changes in the past few months with universal credit. We've speeded up payments, advances are much more generous than they were. We've relaxed the rules around the housing element of it so that rent arrears shouldn't be building up. So inherently their argument is people should not be struggling financially. But the truth is that many are. And there is one figure in today's report that gives a hint of why that is the case. Despite the improvements that have been made in how quickly they are paying the benefit, today's report says that around 300,000 people this year will experience problems in getting their first full universal payment.
Michael, thank you.